Thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone. I have to tell you that since I broke my glasses yesterday, my world has become a darker place, and I'm trying to cope with that just a little bit. Someone up at the Capitol yesterday accused me of trying to be cool, and I said it'd take a lot more than glasses to make me be cool. But I realized I was driving in when it was still quite dark outside that the folks who were in real mortal danger were those in dark clothes going through the crosswalks, and so I had to slow down. Again, good morning and welcome everyone. These are delightful events. It gives us the opportunity, as those of you who are veterans know, to really expose the outstanding work that is done at Utah State University to those of you on the Wasatch Front and in other areas that don't have the opportunity to see on a more regular, on a more daily basis, the kinds of exciting research that is being done on our campus. This is our first for 2013, our kickoff. We have what we think will be an excellent agenda for this year. We will have 3 additional presentations. In May, we will have the delightful opportunity to hear from Rob Gillis, who is the director of the Utah Climate Center, Utah's climatologist, and what a great topic for us as we hope we get to spring by May when he's here. But Rob will do just an outstanding job of helping us better understand some of the things that are happening on the weather front. In August, Maria Norton will share her research, and it's truly outstanding research on Alzheimer's and dementia, and I think you will very much look forward to that presentation. And then later in the fall, we'll hear from Kathy Hartman and Ed Stafford, who are working with wind-powered energy, and we will look forward to that. We think these are great learning opportunities for all of us, and let me just add again my thanks to Regents for their support. It's gone on for several years now, and thank you very much. We love the partnership. This morning, we have the opportunity to hear from one of my longtime colleagues and very good friends, Dr. Douglas Jackson Smith. Now, Doug, over the years, has been one of those individuals who has had the enormous capacity and ability to reach across disciplinary lines, and so you'll see that this morning. He's a sociologist, a social scientist, but a social scientist who understands the language of the hard sciences and has been able to create collaborations with colleagues from across campus and across disciplines in dealing with issues that clearly must have a multidisciplinary focus. Doug is going to talk with us a little bit about water-related issues, how we address the very difficult challenge of preserving Utah's water resources. As all of you know, it's one of our most important natural resources. My father told me when I was a kid that the only homicide that ever occurred in my home county was over water rights. And I think that you all understand the importance of water, and we certainly did in that context. This last year, the National Science Foundation awarded Utah a $20 million grant to address issues of water quality, usage, and sustainability in the state, which resulted in what is known as the iUTAH initiative, and I assume Doug will talk a little bit about that. But it is a statewide effort to really understand and to model our watersheds and to educate students and managers to be more effective in what they're doing. Doug is currently a professor and director of graduate studies in sociology at Utah State University. He has worked to integrate, as I suggested earlier, the human dimensions into transdisciplinary scientific research on water, agriculture, and environmental issues. He has been the lead investigator on numerous grants focusing on these kinds of issues. He has twice been awarded the Researcher of the Year at USU and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. He recently served on a National Research Council Committee on Sustainability Agriculture for the 21st Century, and the list goes on and on. I think you will thoroughly enjoy what Doug brings to us this morning. Unfortunately, I have testimony up on Capitol Hill at 8 o'clock, and so I won't be able to stay and listen to him. But again, thank you, everyone, for being with us, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Douglas.
Shane, do I need the big mic? Can you guys hear me still? I've got this mic, okay. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to come to this session. I hear a lot about these on campus. They're very well regarded by our colleagues, and I have to say, as Stan brings up the issue of water and homicide, my concern is only that Utah, being a state in which gun rights are so cherished, and water is such a political issue, perhaps my choice of topic is a very dangerous one. Hopefully all of you will treat or hear what I say with politeness. You're also a much more alert crowd than I would be used to if I were approaching a class of 125 students this morning at 7:30. And so I appreciate you all being wide awake and paying close attention, which is not always the case this time. Okay, Stan said a few things about myself. The only thing that I would underscore is that I came to Utah State because there's a wonderful collection of social scientists who work on natural resources that have come together, not just in my department, but across Utah State. And we're nationally known for this across the world even. And it allows me a platform to do the kinds of interdisciplinary work as well as the social science work I'll talk more about today that's rather unique. And I think Utah State deserves a lot of credit for creating that kind of platform. But my topic today is about social science. And what I hope to do is convince you that the social sciences have something valuable to offer that is scientific. I'm fully aware of a national dialogue, a statewide dialogue about trying to target the sciences that are most likely to produce value in jobs and employment and economic development, and I fully believe the social sciences are part of that. And I'm going to try to do that by using the issues of water research and water policymaking as an example of where I think good social science can make a difference. So let me just lay a very quick backdrop to the water situation in Utah. First off, Utah uses a lot of water. We're second in the nation in terms of per capita water use and domestic uses, I think following only Nevada on a per capita basis. We also have tremendous rates of population growth, and so we can forecast as we move into the future the population doubling in Utah, certainly by 2040 or 2050. Which means the pressure on our water supplies from population growth and domestic use is only going to rise. We're also, paradoxically, one of the driest states in the nation. And I think when you look statewide, we'd be considered the second most arid state in terms of the available rainfall. Interestingly enough, we've never had enough rainfall to support settlement or agriculture in the valley bottoms, but rely completely on snowmelt and the mountain systems to collect our water during the winter, and then we survive on that, and that's how we've been able to build the society that we have in the West today. My colleagues, I'm not a climate scientist, but I hear a lot of stuff about what's going on with climate and weather. They certainly forecast, and I'm sure you've heard about this, that the climate looks to be making the situation more challenging in the future. We expect Utah in particular to get warmer. We're at the sort of crossroads of the models where we're not likely to see water or precipitation decline or increase, but remain roughly the same. We're likely to see that because of the warmer temperatures show up as rain more than snow. Weather may be more volatile, and all this comes together into a pattern of earlier runoff. Now, the social context of water use in Utah can only be understood if you look at where we use our water right now. One window on this is to understand water withdrawals, where we take water from groundwater and surface water sources. In the nation, about 20% of all water withdrawals are used for agriculture. But because agriculture in the West really occurs only through irrigation, like I say, in the summer we don't get enough precipitation, almost 90% of our water withdrawals in Utah are actually used for agriculture, and a relatively small portion used for the urban populations and the domestic uses. However, an awful lot of the water that's used by agriculture is actually not consumed by agriculture. It's used in a way that returns into the system, and when you do the math, or when other people do the math, and they tell me what the answer is, you find out that about 2/3 of the water use is actually in agriculture and about 1/3. And so my rule of thumb is about 2/3, 1/3 when I think about the Utah water consumption picture. And you can drill down a little bit deeper and look at the consumption picture. And there's another 2/3 rule that within our domestic environment, about 2/3 of our water use is used for outdoor landscaping. And so only about 1/3 of that third is the water that we use inside our household. So most of our water picture is a picture of using water for irrigation purposes on our agricultural farms or on our domestic landscapes. So the puzzle, the sustainability challenge that I think Utah faces is that we've done fairly well to get to this point. We've got a system in place that has allowed this valley, this state to blossom and thrive, and we've been able to use our water resources strategically to support building, I think, originally an agricultural society and now a very successful urban and industrial society. But as we look to the future, the systems we've evolved with that kind of usage history, I don't think are particularly well positioned to guide us into a future in which most of the growth and demand for water is going to come from a sector that doesn't tend to use a lot of the water right now, and it's going to have to negotiate and figure out how we're going to allocate and address water sharing between urban and agricultural uses. The U.S. Geological Service has a map of water conflict zones. I'm not going to show it to you, but we are considered one of a small handful of areas that they expect a high degree of potential conflict over water. And what I'm hoping to convince us of today is if we do enough science and we have enough good conversation, we can probably negotiate this without the conflict. We can find solutions that work for the state. All right, so what can science do? I am a social scientist. I'm a university researcher, and I believe in the core of my being that what we need is more science, more research, more information, more facts to make good decisions. That's kind of what I preach to my students, and it's what I really think my role in the world is. It's one role among many, but it's a very important role. But an interesting question when you think of this water puzzle is what kind of science do we need? An awful lot of what we need is going to be physical science. We need people who understand hydrology. We need good and constantly improved climate forecast models. We need information about engineering and technology and water storage and water transportation. But I'm going to argue today that that's not enough, that good information, good facts, good research on the human dimensions of the water puzzle have to come out of the social sciences. That's the people who know how to do this well and the people who are going to be able to help provide informed decision making. So I asked the question, what is social about water? Side note, I'm a sociologist of agriculture most of my career. And I'm always talking to audiences of farmers and agriculturists, and they always are shocked that there's a sociologist talking about agriculture. Like, what's social about agriculture? And my point is, everything is social about agriculture. Remove the people, you have no agriculture. Well, I think everything is social about water. The hydrology of this basin, the hydrology of this state, cannot be understood without understanding what people are doing to move water around the state. It's no longer a gravity-driven system. And so literally the water is carried and used, and the hydrology is a human hydrology. My colleagues are tired of me using that phrase. At the same time, the ways in which people think about water, the way they use water, their aspirations for water are societally driven. They're determined, in a sense, by the society that has evolved in the West. And anything that we care about water, any crisis, any political issue, any societally important issue, is an issue because it affects people. There are lots of things about water that don't affect people. They're not things we spend a lot of time talking about in society. I'm going to assume most of you know what the social sciences are, but I made a picture just in case. The social sciences, to me, include at least the big five. You get sociology, the big one. Anthropology, political science, economics, they think they're important, and psychology. And then there's a lot of sort of hybrid sciences that have emerged, kind of fields within the disciplines. And I will say, and I'll just assert, that it is a science. We have theory, we test hypotheses, we collect data, we check that the world fits with our theories, and we progress through time with improved understandings and models about how the world works. But the world that we study is a very difficult world to study. Stan talked about me talking to the hard scientists. Well, I like to think of it as that's the easy science, and we have the hard science, because our subject matter moves. Our subject matter is complex and thinks for itself, and it makes it really more challenging to do conventional sort of experimental science, and we've innovated a lot of very creative ways to address that challenge. So today, my goal is to sort of outline three contributions that I think the social sciences make, that we are really good at documenting facts about behavior. We're good at trying to pick apart, and I'll spend most of my time on this, understanding behavior. And we have some really important contributions to make in terms of decisions about policy and how society deals with water. So initially, let me talk a little bit about documenting use. And I'm talking about the full range of water uses, irrigation behaviors, water consumption behaviors in households, and even the management of large water systems like a reservoir or water distribution system. couple of points I'd make. First off, reality is not obvious. The danger of being a sociologist is everybody's a human, and they think they know things themselves, and they do. Everyone has direct access to society and the social world. This is not true always in the other sciences. The chemists particularly, like none of us know what it is they see, but you all see what I see. You have access to that information. But I tell my students, and I hope to convince you, that reality that we experience is a partial window. It's an incomplete window about what really is going on, and you can get more systematic and more accurate purchase on what the world, the social world is, if you go about it scientifically. So common wisdom is often what we test, and common wisdom is what we often find doesn't actually describe the way the world really is, and we're very curious about that. How is it that people assume understandings of the world? But everybody has that partial window. By the same token, we've got this big toolkit that we can use that we are ranging from a systematic observation and field interviews and watching people and talking to people to very scientifically implemented surveys, which I'm sure almost all of you have once upon a time received, hopefully from someone who knew what they were doing, to the analysis of existing records in creative and systematic ways that gives us some good ideas about what's going on. And I want you to at least understand that the point is not to describe the typical human. I've told you Utah's average per capita domestic water use is so many gallons per person. There's almost very few people that have that actual number, and the real art of the social sciences is in understanding and documenting variability. This is a map that a couple of colleagues of mine on a team at Utah State have gone about doing that highlights the ratio of water that's actually used by households in parcels, I think this is from Logan, and versus the amount of water that we think their plant community needs to use. And so you can look remotely at the kinds of vegetative composition of their plots, and you get a range of ratios that are below 1, what you think watering right to the level of what the crop needs are, the yard needs are, to well over 5 times what that value is. And just in one neighborhood, you're going to see tremendous variability in water consumption behavior. We see this variability occur across communities just as much. And so some of us will look and zoom in, why is this household different than their neighbor? And then we might zoom out and look at why is this neighborhood constructed in a way that systematically produces outcomes that are different than this other neighborhood. And we might zoom out even higher and say, why is Utah different than Pennsylvania? What is it about the social context and the human dimensions that drive those kinds of decisions? So that's the variability side. The real fun stuff is explaining the variability. Now, showing the variability is a pretty important step to highlight how simple assumptions about humans are X, are Y, can often be misleading. But understanding behavior is where the fun stuff happens. Why are some high? Why are some low? What explains it systematically? And we approach this in a variety of ways. Like I say, there's a wide range of social science disciplines. We each have our favored level of analysis, we might say. Some of us are very excited about what happens in individuals' heads. We talk about the psychologists here, the individual level understanding of what motivates and drives behavior. At the other side of the extreme, you might have people who think about this as a society. What is it about the American society that drives Americans to behave the way they do? And there are some certain phenomena that can be understood at both of those scales and everything in between. We also debate and discuss what we think are the most important drivers. And let me just, by a show of hands, which one do you think the economists would support as the most important driver of human society and behavior? Well, you won't have to vote. Anthropologists, sociologists, people who study technology, people who study policy. Everyone tends to gravitate towards the thing they study. In my experience, we all have partial truth. In other words, it's the coming together of these that has allowed me to understand the world. And I found sociology actually to be a very welcoming discipline. I have a master's degree in economics that gives me street cred with the economists, but the idea that you can find some element of understanding the system through each of these different kinds of windows. But that's some of the complexity that we deal with. When you zoom in and you're trying to understand individual level water behavior, it's important to understand that people are both economically rational, But they're also rational and pursue their self-interest in ways that go beyond economics, because I would suspect if you were to look inside yourself, there are many decisions you make that do not maximize your economic interests, but maximize other things that are important to you. And so people do things that they want. But what they want is complicated. And this is where our job gets really hard. What they want is certainly things that benefit themselves economically and non-economically. I have to confess, I look out for myself. But I care deeply about others. And so my behavior is going to be shaped in part by my interactions and my relationships with other people. And that's the sociology moment, if you will. We think of ourselves as social beings, and there are very few humans that are not. And we also care about things that are, when it comes to water, directly related to what happens to us in the place we live. And we care about things about water that happen to us, let's call it off-site. Things that happen to us in other places. Let me give you a couple of illustrations. This is a house in the Cache Valley that I was driving by and got a picture of, so I've got a nice slide. But it tells a nice story. You look at a house like this, built in the country, large lot, nice conventional bluegrass lawn, a constructed pond, which is a primarily, I'm guessing, recreational or aesthetic contribution to the landscape. What did this person go through in deciding that this is the way in which they wanted to construct their landscape, their house, and their water use? This drives their water use. It reflects certainly some economic calculation, but I'm guessing most of their decisions are not going to yield fruit in terms of investment return on their dollar. But it maximizes their desire for a country lifestyle, it maximizes their desire for an aesthetic that looks a certain kind of way, and it reflects sort of an inherited set of values and priorities that I'll talk about in a minute as sort of being socially driven. We also have connections in terms of thinking about what our preferences do at the larger level. This is a Driggs, Idaho Valley, where I've done some research. And we know, for example, that all the urban populations live along the base of the mountains where the water comes out. How those populations grow, divert, utilize water completely influences what's available to the farm community in the valley floor. What that farm community does with water completely influences what the people in the city see when they look out. When we drive into our Cache Valley, the quintessential experience is seeing a green, irrigated agricultural valley. We all benefit from that, but we all are dependent on a farm community being vital and vibrant and still willing to maintain that community. So we are connected in these interesting ways. And so what rational actors do within their own units have these sort of aggregate connections and responsibilities. And we like to study kind of ways in which aggregate phenomenon occur from individual level behavior. We also have contributions that society cares about that may not even be the same kind of level of concern that I'm talking about before, because we don't see it directly. But this is the Cutler Marsh in the Cache Valley, and one of many projects I work on is looking at water quality in Cache Valley. What drives water quality in the Cutler Marsh are a whole series of decisions made by farmers and cities residents throughout that landscape, and they all pool right here. They all aggregate right here. And so these connections are very important to understand, and ways in which society organizes feedbacks that drive behavior around those outcomes is what we study. Sociologists love social things. At least that's what we tell them in 101. And social factors can come in a variety of shapes and sizes. On the one hand, we like to understand the role of social norms and cultural values. The idea is that each of us has an instinctive sense of what is a right or a good use of water, what's a legitimate use of water. And that's something that we absorb through socialization, through being raised in a culture, through getting feedback from our friends and neighbors. And these are evolved characteristics that are social, that are a signature of society. We also study group dynamics and networks, that who we know, who we interact with, is where we get our information about our impacts on others, and where we learn to care about certain kinds of impacts more than others, that we see them more clearly than we see some other things. And then many sociologists study what I'll call social structure, that the ways in which societies are actually organized into different kinds of structures by race and ethnicity, by income, and by gender, by all these sort of cleavages that help us understand that societies have lines of structure, and what those mean in terms of systematically explaining variability in behavior and the impacts of those behaviors on different subpopulations in a society. Let me give you one example of social factors. There's a colleague I have down at the Arizona State University, I'm pretty sure, Kelly Larson, who studies landscape water use in Phoenix. And what she has done is gone and looked at how different neighborhoods evolve different kinds of landscape looks. This is one traditional neighborhood with a regular grass lawn and typical landscaping. This is a fun one, which is a landscape of artificial grass. That's not real grass. Apparently, it's like a carpet of grass, which apparently doesn't need to be mowed or watered, and communities have been built with a landscape that tries to aspire to a grass-like environment that doesn't require water. And then you get the sort of extreme xeriscaping landscapes where they're trying to build a desert image. What Kelly has found is that people tend to manage their front yards very differently than they manage their backyards. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because people see your front yard, and they're going to care about the image they project, and they might make different decisions if it only impacts themselves in the backyard. They are also very responsive to what their neighbors do. And so you tend to have neighborhoods that tend to acquire a certain kind of look. And if you're the outlier yard, you become a social pariah, and eventually the outlier yards are squeezed out. And anyone who's tried to build the one xeriscape yard in a landscape that doesn't xeriscape knows the kinds of looks you get as people drive past or walk past your house. She also understands that these preferences for landscapes evolve through time and have a history. And that history is somewhat rigid, and so it's very difficult to go into a neighborhood that's sort of got a culture and a tradition and a look and convince them to go down a different path. So these paths, as we say, are somewhat path-dependent. Now, individuals are not the only actors. I talk a lot about individuals. It's easy for us to understand. But a lot of social scientists study organizational behavior. And organizations that are important in the water world are the organizations that pretty much decide when and how and at what cost we get our water. And these decisions by organizations, I'm increasingly convinced in Utah, are probably the most important decisions when it comes to driving even individual level water behavior. Now, what do I mean by organizations? Oops, wrong button. How was that one? In Utah, I'm talking about things like a city utility that provides you with your water if you live in an urban place. I'm talking about the state water and regional water agencies and conservancy districts. I'm talking about irrigation districts and canal companies, which, as I said at the beginning, really manage the vast majority of Utah's water supply. And some pictures that are helpful to understand the complexity of the organizational landscape include this one, which shows all the water retailers in the Salt Lake Valley. There are over 20 separate retailers or providers of water to the urban population in the Salt Lake Valley, each of which devises its own infrastructure, its own pricing, its own technology, develops its own incentives, and therefore has its own kind of signature on what individuals who live, the same individual in each of these places is going to behave differently. When you look at my valley, it's even more complicated because we have such a recent and strong agricultural heritage that most of the landscape still is managed by irrigation companies. I drew a yellow outline around the rough boundaries of the city of Logan. Within the city of Logan, which is a water provider to most of the residents, we have over 12 different canal companies and irrigation districts, each represented by a different color, and many of the Logan residents get their watering for their landscape still from a canal company or an irrigation district, which the city has absolutely no authority and control over. And so the management of these systems and the kind of built organizational environment certainly affects how people think about and deal with water. My colleagues at Utah State have also, there's a group, Joanna Enterwada and Roger Kellgren and Christopher Neal have done a number of these studies, and one of their projects looked at variability in water use. They're the ones who did that map I showed you earlier at the landscape scale, at the parcel scale. And what they've found, looking at Layton, for example, is that attitudes, environmental concern, motivation about water conservation is almost useless in predicting which households use the most water. What the most important variable in predicting water use within Layton was the type of irrigation system. Do you have a hose, which you drag around and have to turn on and off? Do you have an automatic or a system that you can turn on automatically by spinning something in the ground? Or is yours on automatic timer? And the households that use by far the most water are the ones on automatic timers, which ironically were developed to help promote efficient water use. And it's the convenience of the automatic timer that drives overuse, and it's the inconvenience of having to drag a hose that leads people to water the least amount possible, because it's a lot of work to go outside and drag a hose. And so technology and the built environment is sometimes a better predictor than the things we might think about, which is being educated about water use and water conservation and the outcomes of your behavior. And that applies to businesses and schools. It also, there's a vast literature on water conserving technology like low flow toilets and efficient showers. And what people often find is that there's compensatory behavior where people take longer showers and flush twice. And you end up using more water than you've used before you start. So people are messy animals, and understanding this is important. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of institutions, and it's a huge topic, and it's where I do a lot of my work, but it's too huge to get through today. But all of those individuals, all those organizations, all the culture and so forth takes place in an environment in which society has developed rules. And those rules of the game are things that have evolved, and they've been decisions that were made often publicly, and they set the stage within which we behave, and we call those social institutions. Now, the biggest example in water is water rights. Water rights are, in the West, allocated to the earliest claimant, and so we know there's this really interesting dance where people who are very junior water rights owners have problems sometimes during droughts because we serve the most senior water rights holders first. And then issues like land use and development policy or rules about water use at the local level, and environmental laws is an increasingly important part of the social institutional fabric. Thinking about water law, I started saying, you know, prior appropriations is important, and it's fundamental. You could not explain water behavior in the West without a deep understanding of water law. What that means is if we were to take the same people and the same business and the same operations and plop them down with a different water law environment, they're going to behave differently. And increasingly, our water law is producing some very interesting unanticipated outcomes. And just one example that I study is looking at efforts to improve irrigation efficiency in those irrigation networks that I showed you a map of, all these canals. And because we're worried about water supply and those canals are very leaky, there have been big efforts to save water for other uses by making those canals less leaky, making them cement or enclosing them in some way. And what has actually happened is that's not freeing up water for other users, because the water rights institutions incentivize things in such a way that there's no incentive to give that water back to either urban consumers or the environment, but rather to use that water more productively within agriculture. That's what I would do if I had those water rights in agriculture, and it makes sense. And it turns out that a lot of that water that was leaking was actually the people downhill's water supply, and we're drying up a lot of junior water rights owners' water supplies when we thought we were saving them water. And finally, I think the way I look at the water conflicts and the sustainability puzzle in the state is that our institutional environment, which has a long history and evolved around meeting certain needs, is not particularly well designed, I think, for the challenges of the future. I'm not telling you what the answer is, but I'm saying that our institutional environment right now and the friction and the conflict we're going to feel directly derives from that mismatch, from the lack of good fit between institutions. And we know from studying history that eventually institutions evolve and address those friction points. So put it all together and think like a sociologist. When you think about water use, I hope you at least can think about it through the lens of what drives individual behavior, organizational behavior, the role of institutions, the role of social context, and how human behavior reflects this sort of complexity of mutually reinforcing activities. I put it in a sentence that water use and the patterns of water use are never natural. By their very nature, they're a signature. They have the imprint of society, and they're always things that are defined by society. Now, who do you want to help you understand a phenomenon that's quintessentially social? I think it's people who think deeply and have theory and decades of research behind them who study each of these components of the system. I said there's a third part. Third part is shaping policy. I won't talk much about it, but basically, all that research I'm talking about can be used to shape and inform the decisions of policymakers in society, to test their assumptions about what drives the problem, to understand clearly where the problem is, and that variability means it's not all the same problem everywhere. To study systematically with research. A lot of social scientists are policy evaluators, to study whether or not adopting a certain kind of policy has the impacts that we think it's going to have empirically by going out in the world and doing that. There's only a few things we can control through policy, and they tend to fall into two categories. We can work on educating people and informing people, or we can work on changing the institutions. The research shows that education alone can be effective, certainly in the short run, but that education alone without serious attention to dealing with institutions typically fails in the long run, because these behaviors, these social networks, these cultures evolve with the institutions, and if you're just working on just information to the local water user, you're likely to see things not come out the way you want. But changing institutions is hard. Changing institutions is painful. It's always been painful. It wasn't easy when we settled this landscape, and that's when Stan's father knew someone who got shot, because they were trying to figure out what the rules were going to be about water and whether those rules were legitimate, right? So people, this kind of phenomenon is going to require an awful lot of hard work. I think the puzzle, as I look to the future, is how do we marry at least 3 or 4 major constituencies? How do we address the needs of our traditional major water consumption community, agriculture, which I've studied for 2 decades and am completely interested in seeing be viable and sustainable, while also addressing the reality that the growth in water demand is coming from urban areas. And I haven't talked a lot about it because it's a whole another talk. Also addressing the increasing concern about environmental uses of water, the in-stream flows for wildlife, the value that water presents to us for recreation, and the value that has to us economically. These are all people who care deeply and passionately about getting enough water and getting water in ways that meet their needs. And somehow we're going to have to move towards an integrated, sort of a new set of rules and a new set of institutions that allow us to do that. And let me give you one example of something I think that moves us in the right direction. How do we get there? How do we facilitate this adaptation? Well, I think we can do 3 things. We can provide good information. That's my science moment. Just double my budget. Legislature's meeting, leave this meeting, walk down there, ask them to raise the funds for sociology. Good science breeds better decisions. I'm not naive. Decisions are not made on the basis only of fact and science. I've never seen such a thing happen. But I know that better decisions are made when you have good science. And then you always become an issue of values and priorities, and that should be an issue of political discourse. We should encourage integration. I'm very concerned that the water dialogues I hear in the state are very balkanized into their little communities. I go to meetings with water users and irrigation companies and irrigators, and they've got a certain take on the water issue, and then I go to meetings with the urban populations, and they've got a very different take on this puzzle. And the very little dialogue across those communities. And the environmental community has a very little dialogue, certainly with the farmers and irrigators. And how do we get to a point where we can integrate an appreciation for all those different pieces of our complicated social puzzle? Finally, we need innovative solutions. We need creative technology. We need creative law and policy. We need creative programs to kind of get us into that place. Now, here's the answer to all your problems. One major initiative that's going on in Utah that I've been lucky to be part of, which we call the iUTAH, and I won't bore you with the long title. It's better just to remember it's called iUTAH. Essentially, it's an investment over the next 5 years by the National Science Foundation in the state of Utah. It's not an investment in Utah State University or even only in research. It's in the state of Utah to build a science foundation to help us make better decisions about water. And so we brought together researchers from all the institutions of higher education. We brought together people from all the disciplines that are interested in water, which I celebrate every day. And we're going to be working collaboratively with people who are water decision makers in the state to try to understand how they make decisions and how science can be brought to the table to better understand the complexities of this water system. So our work falls into a whole lot of research, but also a whole lot of training of a future science workforce. We're training high school kids. We're training undergrads and grad students. We're training, we've got a lot of outreach for the public. And I just came back from a 2-hour meeting yesterday with the city of Logan about water and what water decisions they make involve. Social science, I hope you now understand, is a complicated beast. I hope you understand, and I couldn't give you very many specific details, that it offers an awful lot in the area of good facts. We've got good theory. We know how to bring research to the puzzle to solving policy problems. And I'm going to just conclude by pointing out, as I said at the outset, I'm not alone in this. I'm part of a pretty big community of scholars. An awful lot of the work I'm showing you is the work of others. But we're lucky in Utah to have an institution like Utah State that has such a strong social science community. and a strong water science community across all of our institutions. I think this is going to be an exciting time. These are just some of the people who've been very helpful over the years in doing work here. Now, I know I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. Hopefully I've done so, and I'll finish there. Thank you.
If there are questions, now's the time.
I have a general question. I've done a lot of work with Utah State Prison. I understand you're thinking again about relocating, and at some point they probably need to. It'd be a real economic change. Why not have, in the old days, the old prison used to really take care of a lot of their own as far as raising crops and so forth. They got their own hot houses and other things. That seems like something that we can utilize some of these institutions like that specifically to do it a lot more appropriately. Who do you go to? Who do you say, all right, let's look at it a little better? Because all, as a sociologist, you know, if they move it out to Gunnison or somewhere else, boy, talk about a significant impact. Most people don't know there are at least 1,000 volunteers at the Utah State Prison. I don't know where you get them to get a Gunnison, but just you take something like that. Who's going to stick up for them?
I mean, the issues of the prison move, I'm not familiar enough to answer in detail, but I certainly know that this is a tangent on this, but the science community is actually becoming very interested in prisons as a place to engage prisoners in science. And so you talk about raising your own food. That may or may not be important in terms of providing affordable food. What it provides is opportunities for prisoners to be integrated into society, which we all want in the long run. And there's a colleague we have now at the University of Utah who's just arrived in the last year who's done a phenomenal project in Washington State. And part of why they brought her to the University of Utah, working with prisoners doing the science, setting up labs, setting up, they produce moss for the rainforest. And so they have little plugs of moss that they're raising. And the benefits to the prison are such that the prison warden thinks it's the best thing since sliced bread, and they want to expand it to other prisons. And she's now come to Utah, and she was up talking to us a month or two ago. There's a number of us talking about going into the prisons and saying, okay, what part of this project might we do with prisoners as a population that we could do science with and help raise some of the bars. It's probably not going to be our focus, but it gets at some of those issues you're talking about.
Real quick,
yeah.
Utah State used to have a campus on the prison.
Right.
So did Salt Lake Community, and I teach for Salt Lake Community, used to teach there. They're both gone.
I know that.
Great system. Probably the highest unemployment of about any country in any state of the country is at Utah State Prison. It's like 80 to 85% unemployment, and the goal nationally is to have them employed heavily. I think you're exactly right. Hopefully somebody looks at that as an example of how to utilize things more effectively.
Good point. Someone had a question back there.
More of a statement. Is I agree with about 95% of what you're talking about. But there's some realities in the state of Utah this way nationwide. You talk about 87% of your water being used in agriculture. And I would guess that probably out of that 87%, that's owned by probably 5 or 6% at the most
Right.
of actual people. Now, if you look around this room here, you see by far a vast majority of either gray hair or no hair. And it's the same way in the legislature. I haven't been there a little while, and when I went into the legislature, there was approximately 20 out of 104 legislators that were directly involved in agriculture and making their living. We are now down to one. And this session, there's probably 10 to 15 bills on water, which you probably know. Well, now as we know in politics, you get bills through by who has the most money to hire the most lobbyists to push an issue that direction. And there's no one in the legislature that really has the common sense or knows what the reality is as far as water law is concerned and agriculture is concerned. There are lots of social people out there that know it, but they don't have the background that we've been talking about here today. And so I think that the social sciences that you're talking about can be greater influence than the actual influence that's taking place in agriculture and also the owners of that water. We can change the policy in water to a great extent, but most of that water is already has a vested right in how it was worked and how it's been used over the years. And so it's going to be a real challenge to work this through, and I think your social sciences will be an even important discussion in moving water to those areas. But I think it's very important that you also put an honest face on that social science and not skew it one way or another. Because people just don't understand it. And the more laws you pass, the more laws you have to pass to fill the holes of the laws that you passed before, because the attorneys have found loopholes in it to skew it so it doesn't benefit all the people.
Right.
So those are my...
Your comment is great, and you're fortunate in that I come to this issue from the ag side. I mean, I'm a rural sociologist, and I spent most of my career studying farmers, and that's where I enjoy going out when I'm working. And so I'm sensitive to that community's needs and that community's perspective. But let me just say what I see happening in neighboring states, which is that very rarely in the West has the interest of agriculture been truly in good dialogue with the urban community to come to common answers to things that look out for both parties' interests. What ends up happening in most cases is eventually the population in the urban areas gets to such a point and their political influence is dominant enough that decisions are made that are sudden and harsh and fairly unfriendly. But agriculture usually spends that time digging their heels in and not looking, they don't think it's in their interest to engage in a more constructive way. And so when I talk about integration, I would love to see some kind of forum create that allows that dialogue, that says we can keep, I mean, I know enough about irrigation and agriculture to know that we can make some, if we change institutional arrangements in certain ways, we can keep agriculture whole. We can keep agriculture and the interests of the current water rights owners, we can meet their needs and we can provide for what they're going to require and keep them whole in terms of recognizing the value of their right, while also negotiating ways in which we rearrange how water flows in the state. I'm a little worried that we won't have those conversations, that laws will just be passed and water will be taken, in other words. And agriculture is vulnerable to that. But they're most vulnerable because they're as guilty as the urban community in not talking across that divide enough. Because for the whole history of the state, water is, and still is, in their hands. And they don't necessarily think they're going to benefit if they engage that. But that's what I see. In the back there?
While you speak of integration between environmental, urban, rural, or irrigation, have you found a model that works? Is there a community that's doing that well?
There's a few creative things happening in this state. There's a lot more in other states. We had a meeting a couple weeks ago on water banking and new institutions that allow us to transfer water and thus compensate people who are giving up water and allow water to move in places that laws don't allow it to move right now. Small example in my valley is the legislature passed a special law that allows savings from irrigation efficiency projects to allow that water to be allocated to in-stream flow for fisheries. It's kind of unheard of in Utah. But it allows, on an experimental basis, a farmer to do some things to improve their irrigation water efficiency, which means they're getting the water they need, but they don't necessarily need to keep withdrawing. They can keep that full withdrawal water right. So the problem is if they say, okay, I'm only using half as much water, the law says you now lose half your water right. And I'm not going to volunteer for that. I got 5 shares in my irrigation company, and I'm keeping them. Like, we're not going to go out on a limb and give them up just because someone else can use them for something better. But if there's a mechanism for me to be either retain that right, which is what the law does right now, and allow that water to be used on a fairly permanent basis for other uses like environmental flows or like allocated to new uses, or if I can get compensated for that in some systematic way through a bank that allows trading and so forth, I think those are where the innovative institutional arrangements that are going to be so important are going to come from. And Colorado's done a lot more of it than we have. Nevada's got a kind of different puzzle because their farm community and their urban community are so different. Like, they're all urban people, and they have a farm community, and so I wouldn't want to go there. But here I think we've got the potential to have the same conversation Colorado's had.
From a high-level policy viewpoint here in Utah, is the momentum on increasing supply or increasing conservation, or both?
What I see is both. I mean, I think that there's going to be a continual effort to work on conservation. There's debate about whether we do enough or too much or whatever. We definitely have a lot of conversation about supply, and we focused on major high-level supply decisions. And I think if you follow water, you'll know what those projects might look like. What we, I think, haven't done enough of is the sort of intermediate scale discussions about how we manage these city systems, how we manage the irrigation. I'm really interested in irrigation companies. I'm a member of one. And how those are such critical actors who are not so affected. They're not all affected by big supply projects. My water comes out of a canyon. There is no reservoir. When it stops running, we run out of water. But it means that how we manage that little irrigation company, and there are 50 of them in the Cache Valley alone. There's got to be 1,000 of them across the state. Most of the water conversation about supply and efficiency tends to occur at the really big scale supply projects and the urban efficiency projects, talking about low flow toilets and urban irrigation. I hope you've got the picture that there's big levers in thinking about irrigation systems and how we manage these transitioning kinds of landscapes that are probably getting us as much traction. And that doesn't necessarily mean big supply. It doesn't mean the same kind of efficiency projects that we're familiar with. It's a different framing of the problem. But I'm a little bit of an outlier in thinking that's interesting. There aren't that many people that agree with me. Come on, it's water.
Do you see better policies coming in the future? You know, it's kind of project where there's a great project, there's a water reuse project, but it went from one community to another community across the road. And once that community lost its sewer water into a great project, the dollars that went into the sewer water all of a sudden became a revenue issue for that community. And is there a policy to address good projects, community buy-in, yet these offshoots of revenues, and how as a state do we start to manage some of those issues?
It's a hard question.
I'm sorry.
It's hard to generalize. I look at the literature on how effective are different policies. I think policies that are not sustainable, in other words, ones that require continued infusion of money, worry me a little bit, because in most states, and certainly this state, continued infusion of money to keep a policy or a program alive is probably not something you're going to be able to bank on. And so the question is, can you use those investments into things that get legs? Now, I work in agriculture, and I think in water as well. I study the adoption of technology and programs to promote technology. And I like to tell people that if the technology is right, or if the institutions fit, or if you've stumbled across an innovation that really works, you really don't have to promote it as hard. If you find yourself leaning against the wind all the time and fighting uphill, it's probably not something that's a good enough fit. We've got to go back to the drawing board and say, how have we designed this in a way that actually doesn't fit into the lives of the people we're trying to be? People are complex. They want a lot of things. A farmer doesn't get up and say, I want to manage phosphorus in the morning. They say, I want to milk my cows, and I now know phosphorus is part of that complicated equation. If we design solutions to address their phosphorus issues that aren't also fitting with their concerns about labor shortage and the fact that they got these constraints, they're not going to do it. If we do, they do it. And I think the same is true for water users in urban environments. If we understand how we make decisions about water, we don't get up in the morning, and most of us, and say, how will I manage my water today? We're making complicated, multi-objective decisions and designing programs and technologies that are appreciative of that complexity and try to fit into people's lives tend to be the sustainable ones. And so it may be a roundabout way of answering your question, but I think this issue of sustainability is critical. And the answer lies in experimenting and innovating what that program or policy is to the point where it's got its own legs. And those are usually the ones that fit best. Yes?
You said that Utah is going to be one of the states with the most conflict over water.
That's what they predict.
And
Yeah.
Addressing and underlying a lot of what you said, but can you talk a little bit more about that? Does it seem to be there isn't enough water? Is it something about...
I think it's water shortage as we get tighter and tighter in terms of the gap between supply and demand, there will be years where we got through in the past without harsh measures, and we'll be faced with very difficult choices. And I think that's the big picture. I think that there's also the trajectory of change. We know we're growing at a rate with our urban populations that we're going to double our population in my lifetime. And we've already doubled it in my lifetime several times. And so it's going to be we can project, we're getting to a point where we've allocated almost all our water. We've over-allocated in some basins, I think most folks would agree. And how we grapple with that reality on top of a volatile and perhaps water, I didn't talk as much about the climate issue, but the climate issue is big because the water, by coming as rain, not snow, means we're going to get it earlier in the season. And the time we're going to lose water during the year is the late summer. And that's when we need our water most. And so as we get down that road, the conflict over who gets the water and what the priority is in terms of water and what measures we use to allocate that water, I think we all forecast how it will unplay. Depends a lot on who's in the conversation, what kind of answers we have, what kind of process we've set up. If history is a guide, there'll be some shootings. Hopefully very few. And it won't, and no institutional change. Like our institutions have been the same since 1800, right? We've changed since 1950. They'll keep changing. And it's a slow, painful, messy process, always is. I do get discouraged, but I try not to get discouraged when I see it real life. But I think we have the opportunity as a community in Utah to do better. And hopefully our team and the kind of work I'm talking about will be a piece of doing it better in a less conflictual way than otherwise would likely transpire.
One last question?
Yes?
I appreciate what you were talking about individual behavior, because in our house we have a zero-escape front lawn of our yard.
Yeah.
In the back we have lawn, because we like to play in.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't hear you comment, I'd like to hear you comment on institutional consumers who maybe in the context of all consumers aren't that large, but are visible because they individually have large tracts of maybe school districts,
Right.
parks and recreation, churches.
There's actually people, Joanna Enderwada, who did a lot of the work I'm talking about, had another project with her team that looked at schools in the Salt Lake Valley at a school district. And they said, okay, how much water does each of these schools use? And it was just as variable as her residential consumers. And what drives that variable? Turns out it was the same thing. It's, the schools that had automatic watering systems used a lot more water, and the schools that didn't used a lot less water. But there's variability in there, and institutions are really interesting because you can make a big impact by changing the behavior of one manager, right? Because it's got a big footprint. And in the energy arena, I think a lot of the gains in energy efficiency of early gains have come working with big institutions, universities, schools, government buildings. And I think the same high impact levers are there within institutions for water. In the end of the day, though, it's a pretty small percentage of our consumption in the state. The research also finds, though, that they use more water than residences, generally speaking. That businesses are even more sensitive to making sure that things are green outside their building than we are in our homes, because they think it's a small part of their bottom line, and they don't want to have a brown lawn. There's too big an economic cost to them. So there's challenges there, but the idea of working with organizations is a good one.
And I think we're going to call it there. Professor Doug Jackson-Smith.
Thanks, Dave.
This dialogue would not have been possible without the support of our friends